Hi, in this video I'm going to explain how blind people can see using sounds. First of all, blindness occurs when the eyes or the visual pathways are damaged, leading to the loss of sight. A few decades ago, researchers thought that the human brain and its sensory cortices were hardwired, meaning that they are fixed specifically to the function of processing sound for hearing or processing visual percepts for sight. Today we know that after the loss of one sense, other sensory cortices like the primary auditory cortex or somatosensory cortical areas can account for the lack of vision. This is possible due to the cross-modal plasticity of our brains. Cross-modal plasticity describes the ability of the brain to reorganize and make functional changes to compensate for a sensory modality. Thus, blind people are able to partly substitute vision by the help of other sensory cortices. It is therefore possible to utilize, for example, echolocation, where one makes click sounds, which causes sound to reflect on objects, to get caught by A1 to form spatial information in V1, or make use of the Braille reading system, where the tactile information is used to comprehend language by recruitment of visual cortical areas. This reorganization is possible in young as well as adult brains, which means that structural changes to the brain are made in early as well as late blind individuals. These structural changes of the brain result in behavioral adaptation. In two studies, Lessard et al. And Voss et al. Investigated auditory spatial localization of blind individuals in two conditions: hearing with only one or both ears. They found that blind individuals show above normal performance compared to sighted individuals when localizing sounds with only one ear, while performing equally good when localizing with both ears. The behavioral adaptations of blind individuals can in part be explained by structural changes in the brain, which are assessed by neuroscientific methods like PET, TMS, EEG, or fMRI. These structural changes include the recruitment of neurons in visual cortical areas when processing auditory information. Recruitment describes the responsiveness of neurons in an area to a certain type of stimulation. This can be measured directly by a change in neurons' firing rate, or indirectly by a change in the bold signal from fMRI, or a change in the skull potentials from ERP and MEG recordings. Electrophysiological measurements by Leclerc et al. Have shown that the occipital cortex in congenitally blind subjects is involved in early stages of the processing of sounds at about 100 milliseconds after sound stimulus presentation. Also, spatial neuroimaging with PET and fMRI revealed a WARE stream to the right dorsal extrastriate cortex that processes object position, while a WAT stream to the ventral extrastriate cortex processes object shape. Interestingly, the recruited cortical areas most often closely resemble the function of the same areas in sighted individuals. For example, the area that processes visual motion in sighted individuals also responds to moving sounds in blind individuals. Possible mechanisms mediating cross-modal reorganization include several local mechanisms like local sprouting or the unmasking of silent synapses. Another putative mechanism underlying cross-modal plasticity might be the reorganization of subcortical pathways, for example, the connection between inferior colliculus to thalamic structures occupied by the visual system, or more specifically, the lateral geniculate nucleus. Despite subcortical changes in connectivity, yet another putative mechanism at play could be cortico-cortical mechanisms due to the suspension of early synaptic pruning of redundant synapses in congenitally and early blind individuals. In such a way, connections between the auditory cortex and the occipital cortex could remain. Experiments by, for example, Sharma et al. On rewired animals have shown that the functional specificity of primary cortical areas is dependent on the kind of input they receive. Thus, it is possible that without visual inputs during the synaptic stabilization phase of young children, a significant number of auditory connections to the occipital cortex persist due to their activity. This could explain the massive and functional intervention of this region for the processing of sounds in blind subjects. Most researchers now agree that plastic changes involving the occipital cortex occur in early blind individuals. However, it is still to determine whether the same holds true for late blind ones. In multiple studies using neuroimaging methods, it was observed that even though no behavioral enhancements in sound localization of blinds compared to sighted individuals occurred, visual cortical areas were still recruited, indicating that plastic changes clearly also occur in late blind individuals. However, as late blinds had a synaptic pruning phase in early developmental stages, the mechanisms underlying cross-modal plasticity may not be the same. Therefore, some researchers suggest that late blind individuals rather rely on the strengthening of connections between auditory cortex and visual cortical areas that were only silenced during the synaptic pruning phase. For the rehabilitation of blind individuals, non-invasive as well as invasive methods are possible. Different rehabilitation programs assume that they can trigger above normal skills in blind subjects with, for example, echolocation to dramatically enhance cross-modal plasticity. To attenuate these effects, non-invasive sensory substitution procedures are designed to make use of these intact senses to provide blind people with information related to loss perception. These devices therefore constitute interesting new techniques that are non-invasive, and their working principles follow the natural tendency of the brain to reorganize itself through the other senses. However, at the moment they are mainly dedicated to the study of cross-modal reorganization and do not constitute a realistic introduction to blind individuals. The only substitutive systems widely in use in the blind community is the Braille reading system and the white cane, both relying on a direct and simple coding scheme for information. Invasive visual prosthetic implants, on the other hand, do not aim to enhance cross-modal reorganization, but attempt to stimulate the deficient sensory system directly. Such implants are thus dedicated to late blind individuals, as the development of the visual system and visual experiences are prerequisites to trigger and interpret the visual percept. In fact, the loss of visual abilities following early visual deprivation and the consequent recruitment of occipital regions by non-visual inputs might hinder the reacquisition of the original visual function via the prosthetic implant. Thus, it could help to use neuroimaging before the implementation of visual prosthetics to determine the progress of reorganization of the deprived cortex in order to predict the outcome of the intervention. All right, let's recap what we've just learned. Due to the brain's cross-modal plasticity, blind individuals are able to recruit visual cortical areas via a where stream for the processing of object position and via the what stream for the processing of object shape. This is probably possible through the combination of local subcortical pathway and cortical mechanisms, which may lead to above normal behavioral adaptation in early blind compared to sighted individuals. However, late blind individuals may not use the same mechanisms, possibly because, in contrast to early blind individuals, redundant synapses in visual cortical areas were removed in early childhood. This enables blind individuals to use aids like braille reading or echolocation, thereby processing tactile and auditory information in visual cortical areas. Furthermore, primary cortical areas seem to be task-specific, depending on the received input, rather than a sensory machine that is fixed to its function, which largely impacts how sensory substitution devices or implants are used for the rehabilitation of blind individuals. Still, specific knowledge about the underlying mechanisms and especially the differences of such between early blind and late blind individuals is very limited. Thanks for your attention.